Welcome to Season 4 of the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we discuss business agility through customer experience, employee experience, and digital transformation. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at gregkihlstrom.com and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the host of the Agile Brand podcast. Welcome to a special episode of the show brought to you by Attribution, an advanced multi-touch attribution company that empowers every marketer with the data to convert more buyers and maximize ROI. You can learn more about Attribution at www.attributionapp.com. Today we're going to talk about the coming data privacy changes that will affect marketers, such as third-party cookie and mobile device ID changes. These important methods of tracking and understanding users and their behavior are being modified, which is going to affect your marketing, advertising, and your attribution. We're going to discuss what marketers can do to stay ahead of this. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Cameron Horton, Senior Product Manager at Attribution. Cameron, welcome back to the show. And why don't you start by giving a little background on your role at Attribution?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah.
So here at Attribution, I'm the Senior Product Manager. So I help decide on new enhancements and new improvements for the product, and just making sure that we stay ahead of these kind of trends so that we can keep helping our customers understand their marketing mixes and optimize their ad budgets the best that they can.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, let's dive in here. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there's a lot of changes related to data privacy that are either already in place or in the works, whether that's things like GDPR in Europe, CCPA in California, or others throughout the world. We're going to talk more specifically about both third-party cookies and web browsers, as well as mobile device tracking in a minute. But at a high level, can you describe what is happening as a global trend in regards to data collection and the challenges this presents to advertisers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a great place to start because I think most of us in the industry, or if you're working in this kind of MarTech situation, we're seeing more and more restrictions and I guess protection of customer data in the marketplace. So as you mentioned earlier with the GDPR, that's kind of the first step where these different industries, different governments are starting to take a look and saying, okay, we want to start protecting people's data and their privacy more. So we're really starting to see that kind of crackdown of collecting that data, but also the third-party cookies that you mentioned. So these are the third-party cookies that are, really looking at user behavior and how you're interacting between different sites. So really what we're seeing now as a whole in the industry is that these organizations are getting more and more compliant, more privacy rules, and really trying to protect the user more. And the challenge that this is presenting to advertisers is, we're starting to see less and less access to this data. Before this data was used to customize, let's say, advertisements for individuals. So let's say, you are a sports brand and you wanted to present these ads to people that have looked at sports sites or have searched. Then you can kind of present your ads to people that are more relevant. But with this data starting to become more and more restricted, it's harder and harder to get your ad in front of the right people and really start to see the returns that you were seeing before. So I think this is going to keep happening. We're going to see more and more restrictions, which I think is ultimately a good thing. We're protecting users' privacy and not having this data so readily accessible to everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview. So, let's dive a little deeper here and start with third-party cookies. So cookies have been around since the early days of the internet and often provide a useful function, but some of their usage, and particularly third-party cookies placed on consumers' devices, have come under increased scrutiny. And already companies like Apple and Microsoft have taken some big steps to discourage and disable them. Google is next in line to do this, and many say that Google's actions will put the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, for third-party cookies for good. So from your standpoint, how are companies like Google, Apple, and Microsoft solving for this issue? And what does all of this mean for marketers who are relying on third-party cookies, and what are they going to need to do differently?
Yeah, so looking at what Apple, what Google has started to do, where, if you have an iPhone, you've definitely seen it, where you've seen these different apps where it pops up where you say ask not to track.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing now is that crackdown of third-party cookies. I think eventually, just out of my own opinion, we're going to see them phased out. But this isn't, really the end for advertisers, and it's not really an apocalypse where it's like, oh, we can't get this data. I think really what we're seeing now is that you have to move to that kind of first party method of getting this data. So what the first party is and how it differs than, third party cookies is that in order to access this kind of data where what users are accessing what ads, so going back to our sports analogy, you can still maybe target is maybe not the best word, but present your ads to people that are interested in sports, but you're just not able to use that third-party cookie where, let's say if you're an advertiser, anybody can just kind of access these cookies, bring in the data. You now need to have that relationship with the individual advertisers. So these are the Facebooks, the Googles, the Twitters of the world, where you go to them and say, hey, I would like to access, some user data because I want to make better ads and get them in front of people that actually care. Because let's say if you don't care about sports, you've never played soccer in your life, you don't want to see an ad for a soccer ball. It's not really useful. But the benefit here and like how what you need to do differently is getting this relationship with Facebook and Google, building out these integrations where you have to follow their privacy laws, how to use the data, make sure that you're securing that data in a secure format. So really like the access to this data went from very open source where anybody can kind of access third-party cookies to now much more restricted through the individual companies. But you often have to be validated, make sure, like I said before, like follow those privacy laws. So really these companies need to start either looking for solutions that have access to this first-party information or start building it themselves. Just the one kind of caution note around that is that it's quite difficult to build these integrations with Facebook and Google where the APIs may be documented, but it is quite a lengthy process to get approved. So looking for solutions that have already gone through that, I think is going to be paramount when third-party cookies are kind of done for good.
So let's talk about mobile device tracking as well. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but similar to third-party cookies and how it's being approached. But considering how not only prevalent mobile devices are already, but their increase and continuing increase in usage, losing access to this information is also critical for marketers and advertisers. What can marketers do to kind of stay one step ahead of this part?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and what we're seeing with device IDs, I think is very similar to the third-party cookies, where like we're starting to restrict that data, and really I think it's a very important data point on how people are interacting with your ads. What this was seeing is, if you had that soccer ball ad, maybe it was working great on the desktop, but not so much the mobile. So that could lend you to show you saying, okay, well, maybe we need to optimize for ad, for mobile device.
Yeah.
Perhaps like the image didn't scale correctly or it's kind of off. So the fact that you're losing access to that kind of data is huge, especially with A/B testing and trying to figure out what's performing well and what's not. So in terms of, staying ahead of this as well, similar to that third party, is just going back to that first party data. So having those connections with Google, with Apple, making sure that you understand and that you kind of follow the rules that they have in order to protect the customer's data, and having it so you can come in, you can still do your customer journey, your attribution to see how mobile is playing a part of your customer journey. It's just now you got to go through more secure methods. It's not so readily accessible like it was previously, like with third-party cookies.
So what does this mean for attribution and for tracking and analytics. I mean, here you're at Attribution, which deals with a lot of this stuff. So, how is this affecting, what you're doing, as well as how marketers think about their tracking and analytics?
I think the greatest impact for this is going to be felt by advertisers that were using these third-party cookies to analyze and track their ad platforms.
Yeah.
However, here at Attribution, and I know with other attribution tools, we kind of saw the writing on the wall a couple of years back where, these kind of cookies were starting to get phased out.
Yeah.
So we went through great efforts to connect with these different ad platforms and start to build out integrations, make sure that, our data warehouses and databases were all secured and kind of met the requirements needed. So for us, with the deprecation of third-party cookies, because we kind of got ahead of this, we haven't seen too much of an impact for us because we've always been a first-party data company. So we're able to still pull in this data. We're still able to provide you with that attribution analytics, with that customer journey. However, let's say you're an individual advertiser for soccer balls again, and you're relying on this third-party data to see, okay, what device types are people looking at my ads? What are their customer journeys? What are they touching? Suddenly that pipeline is going to get cut off. Yeah. So even with all these analytics, if you don't have that data flowing in, ultimately you won't be able to understand the impact of your ads and how your different channels are interacting. So it's going to be becoming more and more paramount to start connecting with applications or attribution or any sort of kind of data warehousing that connects directly to the advertisers, because we can still pull in that data. We can still give you that customer journey, that first touch, last touch. But without it, ultimately, I think those other methods that rely on third-party cookies will just not be able to be effective anymore.
As you mentioned, this is certainly a positive development for consumers and for their privacy, and that's a lot of what's driving this. But we also know, kind of on the flip side, consumers also want, and in many cases demand, personalized experiences that are very much tailored to their needs and past behavior, and thus to information that advertisers are able to glean about them. So, what can advertisers do to balance these needs, and what can they do to move to more of a first-party data model, as you were describing, with less reliance on third-party cookies to enable a personalized experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of focusing on that. So like you said, most users want that customized experience where it's more tailored to their interests. Like if you've never hit a soccer ball, you really don't want to see a soccer ball ad.
Yeah.
I even had it where it's been like I've been in Facebook and I go, why am I seeing this ad?
Right.
It has nothing to do with me. Like, I don't like this. Like, it's funny. I think it is a very funny dichotomy where we want our privacy to be protected, which is extremely important, but we still want to be given a personalized experience that kind of matches our needs. So I think the balance between getting rid of or the deprecation of third-party cookies is a good thing because really anybody could access them. It was, it's challenging. Your data is not secured. It can be sold. We're moving to that more first party. What you're able to do is, you still get that personalized experience, but now you know that the data that you're providing to these ad platforms are secured. They're only giving it to validated partners where they've looked through, said, okay, how are you pulling this data? What are you using it for? Are you securing it correctly? So it kind of strikes that nice balance where you can start giving soccer players still soccer ads,
right,
while having the end user's data secured and really being respectful of the data that you're collecting.
What impact does this have on the actual attribution itself?
Yeah, so I'd say for applications or advertisers that are using third-party cookies, this is devastating.
Yeah.
It's basically like an oil pipeline that's been turned off where that data is gone. It's eventually you're not going to be able to run because if you're relying on third-party cookies where they've already started kind of going through restrictions and deprecation, I think the writing's on the wall where eventually you won't be able to measure and you won't be able to do attribution if you're relying on these third-party cookies. However, for solutions such as ourselves that rely on first-party, what's been great, and the fact that we've gone through and we've spent countless hours building out these integrations, talking with Facebook, talking with LinkedIn, is that it really hasn't impacted us at all because we've always been that first-party data provider or had that data come in through that method. For us, because we wanted to keep that privacy, make sure that we're getting accurate data, for us, it really hasn't changed the impact of our measurement or our attribution. With the use of cookie blockers and stuff like that, we've seen a bit more where it's been a little bit harder to track, but ultimately with this deprecation of third-party cookies, it really hasn't impacted our business or our ability to measure and attribute credit to these different ad channels.
Well, one last question before we wrap up here. For those marketers that might be feeling like they're maybe a step behind what we've been talking about here and readiness for third-party cookie deprecation, some of the other things we discussed, what would your advice be as far as a next step for them?
Yeah, so I'd say for these advertisers that are feeling like they're a step behind, ultimately, I'd actually take a step back and take a look at what your marketing mix is and what your marketing goals are for the next 2 to 3 years. If you're looking for that growth, if you're looking for that better optimization of your ad spend, then taking a look at your tech stack, working with your team, trying to figure out how you're getting that data in right now. If it is, let's say in the case of, you're a soccer ball, like you sell soccer balls, you're like, yeah, I want to sell twice as much next year. Well, how are we measuring that? How are we bringing that data in? How are we tracking the customer journey? Then working with the team, determining whether or not you're leveraging, third-party cookies, or if you have a solution or yourself, working with these individual ad platforms with a first-party data model. And if you are using the third-party where it's going to get deprecated, at that point, I think you can work with your team to start to look for solutions in the marketplace that meet your business goals, that help you understand how your marketing mix is performing, how your budget is being allocated, and that will kind of keep you ahead of the curve. But ultimately, I think it does start at looking at your goals and then seeing if your solution or your tech stack currently supports your goals.
That's great. Well, Cameron, thanks so much for joining the show. For those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you and Attribution are up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the best way is to either go through our website at attributionapp.com. We have a blog post where we push out each week, going through different topics around marketing, attribution, even data security. Or if you're interested in learning more directly from us, feel free to reach out at help@attributionapp.com.
Wonderful. Well, again, I'd like to thank Cameron Horton, Senior Product Manager at Attribution, for joining the show. Thanks for listening to The Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom in this special episode of the show brought to you by Attribution, an advanced multi-touch attribution company that empowers every marketer with the data to convert more buyers and maximize ROI. You can learn more about Attribution at www.attributionapp.com. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by TEKsystems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.theagilebrand.show. To get a copy of my latest book, Meaningful Measurement of the Customer Experience, visit my website at gregkihlstrom.com. Until next week, stay agile.